It's a cold night in Idaho, and you're sitting on your couch watching reruns of Friends. And then you think to yourself, I wonder if my boy Nate is working. I wouldn't mind a little bit of that good, that devil's lettuce if you will. You dial up your local Pizza Hut and sure enough you hear a, hello? Nate, my man, can I get a large pepperoni with extra foil? Oh yeah, Mariner, I'll be there in 20. You hang up. Your night's just gotten a whole lot better. Eventually, you hear the doorbell ring and you open the door and there's Nate. You've known Nate since high school. He was a bit of a nerd, lived in his mum's basement, and you could see that his life really wasn't going anywhere. He hands you your pizza and you see a fresh little dime bag on the top. Months later, you're walking down the street and you see a man drive past in a sports car. And you think to yourself, that looked an awful lot like Nate, but it couldn't possibly be him. I mean, he was a loser. So you brush it off. More months fly past and you notice that Nate hasn't been working at Pizza Hut. Maybe he'd quit. Maybe he'd found a better job. Maybe he started studying. Good on him. So one night you're sitting on your couch and you don't really feel like watching Friends tonight. So you start flicking through the channels. And there it is, that nerdy kid on national news. Nate Norman, facing 12 years for a $37 million enterprise. Your eyes widen. This couldn't be the Nate that I knew. I mean, he was a nerd. But sure enough, there he is, facing trial. Our story follows Nate Norman, a 19-year-old from Idaho who became one of the US's largest drug traffickers. But with the rise of an empire comes the inevitable downfall. One day, Nate was sitting in his mum's basement. He knew his life wasn't going anywhere. Sure, he made money delivering pizzas and a little bit on the top for delivering dime bags, but it wasn't enough. His clients were getting sick of the regular bud that he pushed. One day, his best mate Topher comes over, and he starts telling Nate about this Canadian weed that he'd heard about, known as BC buds. This bud was by far better than the bushweed that Nate had been selling. So Nate thought to himself, Idaho borders Canada. It's not that far to drive, and it wouldn't be that hard to smuggle it across the border. So they toyed with the idea for a bit, but it didn't take them long to hatch a plan. Him and Topher would drive in, grab some BC bud, Topher would drive home, and Nate would walk it across the border. So they tried it. They crossed the border, met a guy at a bar, and bought a pound for $1,400. Topher then drove home and Nate walked the 7 hours it took to cross the border, and sure enough, it worked. But the goods they received were lower quality than Nate was expecting. Regardless, the BC bud was selling like crazy, and before he knew it, his whole supply was gone. So Nate and Topher started making these trips more regularly. They brought more and more back each time. Eventually, they met a supplier that could sell them pounds of it at a much lower cost. And then, they started pulling in grands each week of profit, and to a nerdy teenager, this was a gold mine. So Nate thought to himself, I need to make this bigger. It is a foolproof plan and nothing can go wrong. So he started recruiting. Nate started with his mates who he would pay $1,000 each run, and surprisingly, nothing did go wrong. It actually worked. I mean, sure, it was a very badly kept secret. Nate had people that he'd never spoken to since high school hitting him up asking to be in on the plan. Everyone knew about it. And when I say everyone, I mean everyone. The local police knew about it, but they didn't care, because in their eyes, Nate was some nerdy teenagers selling dime bags, and they had much bigger fish to fry in the community. So they let it slide. Nate's operation kept growing, and he got to the point where he had up to 32 people making 4 to 6 runs a month. And these runs brought in $400,000. At this point, the groups were getting too obvious, so Nate decided to deck them out. They had ghillie suits, they had night vision goggles, and they had a spray, which Nate thought would make them invisible to heat sensors. It didn't. Stuff like that doesn't exist. One night, the boys were doing their usual trip through the woods, but then they noticed something. Headlights up ahead. So they got down and they snuck through the woods. It was a DEA van. The boys were over. Everything they had worked for was gone. This was it. Nate started panicking, but then he realized there is no movement. So he crept closer and he looked into the DEA van and the agents were asleep. So he moved past. They got on with their run and they made it home, bringing in cash money. But this is where things started to go wrong. Nate and his friends had too much cash money. Cash money. That's fine. Nate and his friends had too much money. So they did what any 19-year-old would do with their pockets full of cash, and they spent. And boy did they spend. They bought houses, cars, four-wheelers, jet skis, luxury items. All the nerdy boys had super hot girlfriends, and they partied every day. Nate ended up falling in love with a stripper, which became his girlfriend. He was living his best life. But Nate started changing. He wasn't the awkward teen anymore. He was starting to adopt a Scarface mentality. He bought guns, a lot of guns. He was constantly high on his own supply, and he was always flashing his wealth. His ego became massive. During one party that Nate and Topher had set up, Nate decided that he wanted to shoot his Magnum inside the house. Because why not? He didn't care. In his eyes, no one could stop him. But little did he know, there was someone else in Idaho that knew his plan. But this guy knew his plan long before Nate did. Another nerdy kid that went by the name Brandan was doing this long before Nate was, and he'd found out about Nate's little escapades. I wonder why. I wonder what made it obvious. Worried that his turf was being stepped on, he did what any nerdy kid would do in that situation. He awkwardly knocked on Nate's door, and when Nate opened, he explained. He hired hitmen. Yeah. He wanted Nate and Topher out permanently. So one night, the hitmen target one of the crew's house. He has a close call, but no one is actually killed. It's not really confirmed what happened here, but the hitmen actually ended up killing Nate's rival, Brandan, the guy who hired them in the first place, and they dumped his body in the woods. Eventually, after this, the police started cracking down, and all of Nate's crew are arrested. And boy, crew pointed fingers at Nate quicker than you can say $40 million drug enterprise. Nate's crew received sentences of around 24 to 46 months, but Nate is slapped with a heavy sentence of 12 years. By the end of the journey, Nate and his crew had smuggled in 17,000 pounds of BC bud worth $37 million. The story of Nate and Topher sparked a 2014 movie that goes by the name Cannabis. It's a banger. You all should watch it. I tried to find more information on Nate now, but all I could find is that he's a free man. And this is him and his dad. Topher was sadly killed in 2019 after a fight broke out and he was shot. I'm sure I've missed a lot, but if you want to read the entire story, go check out the website kidcannabis.com and take a look. It's worth it. What did you guys think? I love this story. This is one of my favorite stories of all time, and the fact that all of this is true boggles my mind. And as always, thanks for watching, guys. Like, share, comment, subscribe.